When your country isn't worth fighting for, what is it worth? Years ago, I attended a concert at the Polish Centre for Arts and Culture in Ravenscourt Park, and there's a very strong Polish community there that's been there since the war. Simply put, the reason why there's so many Poles there is that the government in exile was there. So at the beginning of the war, the Poles fought bravely. They failed to defeat the hugely numerically superior German forces, and their country was swallowed whole by a combination of Germany attacking from the west and Russia attacking from the east. They fought bravely, and those who managed to escape came to the UK and they fought throughout the war in the UK. They were instrumental in the Battle of Britain because they had experienced pilots who made up very successful squadrons in the RAF. They were instrumental in North Africa and Monte Cassino. Anyone who's seen the film A Bridge Too Far will remember Colonel Sosabowski, who was parachuted on top of the Germans because we'd planned it so badly. Now, those who survived were told at the end of the war, thanks, but don't march in the victory parade. I think it's fair to say that Churchill and the British were very grateful for everything they'd done, but Stalin had his plans to eat their country, and we weren't in the mood to stand up to starting another war with Stalin. Patton's advice was turn on the real enemy. So thousands of Poles found themselves stranded in Britain. They could go back to Poland, but a lot of those who fought against the Germans were called Nazis because they'd also fought the Russians or even just not fought with the communists. You have to remember the capturing of Warsaw. The Polish Land Army rose up, and the Russians parked on the other side of the river, blocked the Western Allies from delivering food aid to the rebels, and waited for about 40 days until they were defeated, and then waited another few days so that the Germans had time to demolish the city of Warsaw. Russia then installed a nominally Polish communist government who spent most of the previous decade living in Moscow and ensured there was no free and fair election. Those who stayed in Britain realised there was nothing positive for them to go home to. I once met a lady whose family did go back on holidays during communism, but they stayed in Britain because they realised what it meant to go home. When communism fell, the official state symbols of Poland were not in Warsaw, they were in London. Because whilst we recognised the communist Polish government throughout the communist era, we also didn't recognise but put up no barriers, let's say, to the official Polish government in exile, who lived in London, and those people had their own elections, their own prime minister, their own president. They ran a shadow government waiting for the return of liberty and freedom to Poland. And that's why for 40 years a vibrant community of Poles lived in London, always dreaming of back home, but got on with their lives in London. They maintained their culture, they maintained their language, and they maintained their ethnic roots. For a couple of years I lived next door to two Poles, whose grandparents had stayed at the end of the war. They were basically English who spoke fairly good Polish, and had Polish names. Those soldiers, sailors, and airmen, they came to Britain to stand up for what they believed in, to fight for their nation. When Putin invaded Ukraine, I knew a Ukrainian who lives in London. He hadn't been home for about 5 years because he's from eastern Ukraine. Now, he certainly didn't want Russia taking over. He wanted it to be Ukraine. But he didn't want to risk his life. Now, he said, I'm going to return. I will take up arms and fight for my country. And I was surprised. I didn't think he would. Well, You might have gathered, but I don't think very much of the government. But I would hope that if the country was in peril, I would stand up and do my bit, because I am British. If you love your country, will you want your grandchildren to have some connection to their grandparents' land? And when your country is in peril, you have to stand for it. Well, I bumped into that friend, and between numerous drinks, he informed me how he was getting ready. He was going to go back. He was going to stand up to Putin. He was going to join the fight. But he didn't, did he? No, the only time he's left the country since the invasion was to go on holiday to Spain and get a suntan. When I see thousands of Ukrainian men who chose plastering and bricklaying jobs over fighting for their country, it makes me wonder. It's not that I think badly of them, but I think if they won't stand up for their country, how many British people would stand up and fight for Britain and for what they think is right? I would suggest a lower proportion. Whilst it's noble to believe in peace and to oppose war, if your country isn't worth fighting for, what's the point? What's it worth?